Good afternoon. My name is Alejandro Baer. I'm a faculty member in the Sociology department, and I also direct the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which is one of the co-organizing units together with the Center for Jewish Studies and several co-sponsoring departments and centers. I want to thank my colleague Bruno Chaouat as well, who has been an integral part in the organization of this event. The Great Replacement is a white supremacist conspiracy theory. This conspiracy theory is not a new idea, however, it is inspiring a new type of terrorist across the globe. The Tree of Life synagogue killings in Pittsburgh last year, possibly the deadliest attack on Jews in American history, the Christchurch mosque shootings in New Zealand in March this year, the attempt last month to assault the synagogue in Halle in Germany. All perpetrators were motivated by the Great Replacement myth. Who are these perpetrators and who is providing the ideological ammunition? How does anti-migrant and anti-Muslim sentiment correlate with anti-Semitic views? What are the historical roots of these lethal conspiracy myths? What can we do to counter its spread? These are the questions that motivated us to organize this panel. Thank you all for being here. I want to thank especially all our speakers for being part of this critical conversation. Bruno Chaouat, who will intervene first, is professor in the Department of French and Italian and specializes in French thought and literature and in intellectual history and anti-Semitism studies. Riv-Ellen Prell will follow him. She's Professor Emerita of the Department of American Studies. She is the curator of the physical and web exhibit A Campus Divided, Progressives, Anti-Communists, Racism, and Anti-Semitism at the University of Minnesota, 1930-1942. The exhibit opened in 2017, and over 15,000 people have visited the website. Malinda Lindquist is Professor of History and African American Studies. She is the principal investigator for an interdisciplinary workshop grant together with Bruno Minzade, who's Professor Emeritus in the Department of Sociology. This grant involves an intercollegiate partnership between the University of Minnesota, Howard University, Spelman College, and Morehouse College. And the thematic focus this first year is on democracy under threat in times of populism and racial nationalism. The four universities are convening a conference on this question on April 10 and 11 in 2020. Joseph Gerteis is a colleague in the Department of Sociology. He's an associate professor and he studies political culture and symbolic boundaries of inclusion and exclusion in the United States. The roundtable discussion will be followed at 6 p.m. by an educator workshop, and we also welcome the participants of this workshop who are joining us via live stream. Finally, I want to thank all the co-sponsoring units who have helped promote this event: the Institute for Global Studies, Center for German-European Studies, the Human Rights Program, the Departments of Sociology, History, French and Italian, African American and African Studies. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Start our discussion.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, for your presentation. Thank you, everybody, for being here. A fear of a great replacement lurks in the consciousness of the growing far-right and fascist movements in the West. It was there motivating Anders Breivik's terrorist attack in Norway in 2011, and again at the 2017 Charlottesville neo-Nazi demonstrations in the infamous slogan, "Jews will not replace us." Note, as an aside, the irony: Jews will not replace us because we have already replaced them. Is it not what replacement theology tells us, the Christians, as Verus Israel, the true Israel? And great replacement was there in the Pittsburgh massacre, the Christchurch massacre, the El Paso massacre. In the wake of those events, the slogan keeps popping up in the US and international news, and with it the name of Renaud Camus. Camus has no relation to that earlier French writer Albert, the great humanist with whom he shares a surname. Renaud Camus is the originator of the infamous phrase great replacement, grand remplacement in the original, that has gained an unexpected success among international white supremacists and mass murderers. Now, Camus is not Twitter Nero Donald Trump. He is not avuncular beer belly Steve Bannon. He is not salesman manner Richard Spencer. No, he is a French intellectual, a man of letters, not a demagogue, and to dismiss him as a mere ideologue would be a mistake. That's the problem with the French alt-right wingers. They're elitist and literary and classy, and they attract very smart people. They come from an old literary tradition. Camus' audience has never been the masses, and Camus has nothing but contempt for those semi-illiterate murderers who kill in the name of his theory. This doesn't mean, however, that Camus bears no responsibility for the crimes that his theory has inspired, despite his insistent distancing from those crimes. His ideas are perfectly clear, and he deserves the burden of their legacy. But the trajectory that led Renaud Camus to the so-called Great Replacement theory, and then led that theory to become an international slogan of the far right, is tortuous, and it's worth exploring in all its meanders and sophisms. In 2000, Renaud Camus became notorious for a couple of pages of his diary. A major French publisher had been putting out installments of the diary for many years at that point, at the pace of one volume a year. Then in 2000, Renaud Camus wrote that Jews, with few exceptions, cannot enjoy an organic relation with the French language, culture, and literature. In order to really have an authentic connection with French culture, Camus wrote, one must have been French for several centuries at least. Those few sentences provoked an outrage in the French center-left press. A couple of years later, Camus confirmed that his belief in an organic connection between ethnic origin and literary sensitivity was in fact rooted in a naturalistic conception of culture. Indeed, in the aftermath of the national outrage, Camus, feeling cornered, wrote a voluminous book entitled Of Meaning. And in that book, he laid out a bizarre theory, loosely based on the dialogue by Plato, entitled Cratylus. Plato's Cratylus dialogue bears on the nature of language. The question asked by Plato through his two interlocutors, Cratylus and Hermogenes, is the following. Is language connected organically to the essence of the things it describes, or is it the product of custom and social convention? Cratylus' view that language is natural rather than a form of convention was adopted by Renaud Camus, who uses it as the conceptual basis for his own belief that culture is the product of a physical connection with the land and with ethnic origins. The analogy was far-fetched, of course, but it provided the foundation for an ideological claim, namely that people, immigrants, who claim to be French just because they have a French passport, are in fact fakes, even if they were born in France and even if their parents were born in France. They are paper French, phony French. And so that was how Renaud Camus started to elaborate his theory of the Great Replacement, a theory that has far outgrown its origins to attain the level of international influence that we are now witnessing. So if there is a natural connection between culture, place, and ethnicity, then mass migrations threaten that natural connection. The immigrants from Maghreb and Africa, like the Jews who inhabited France before them, will never be genuinely French, no matter how deeply they imbibe French literature and culture. There is something obviously essentialist and certainly romantic in that conception. Replacement theory appeared as a logical extension of Renaud Camus' belief in an organic French culture threatened by the presence of those imposters. Camus has observed, first with anxiety, then with despair, and then with a sense of wrath, the mass migration to France and Europe from Africa that had started with the family reunion policy in the late 70s. He was not wrong to observe that the face of France and Europe was changing with the arrival of these newcomers in successive waves of immigration. It would be absurd to deny that Europe and France are facing some cultural clashes and some new legal challenges. As well, there were the violent attacks on Jews and non-Jews carried out since the early millennium in the name of Islam, attacks that were minimized by the left and exploited by the far right. Sober journalists and demographers have argued that the face of Europe is changing. However, no serious scholar would claim that the great changes are merely a conspiracy, and neither does Camus himself, in fact, rely on conspiratorial explanations. For him, the Great Replacement reflects a structural problem, an emanation of a culture of superficiality tied to late capitalism, petit bourgeois democracy, and to the devaluation of human life. Now, the most recent argument that Camus and his followers have been concocting in order to render acceptable the Great Replacement theory is cleverly built on themes from the left wing and the Frankfurt School theorists in particular, and their critique of instrumental rationality. Such is the line of argumentation in a pamphlet entitled Disposable Man, literally replaceable man, meant to justify the concept of great replacement by embedding it in a general critique of modernity. Everything in a culture of consumerism has become kitsch and junk and disposable. Nothing endures. As a result, humans are now considered disposable material. This is why some social engineers in Brussels are organizing a dystopia by bringing people from around the world without any consideration for cultural differences, because all that matters is matter and quantity and growth. Clashes ensue, but more importantly for Camus, this politics espoused and enforced by French President Macron and German Chancellor Merkel is one of white genocide, quote unquote, or European genocide. This racial component is Camus' innovation, or perhaps I should say perversion, of the Frankfurt School, which, while harshly critical of the devaluation of life in late capitalism, did not use the critique as a pretext for xenophobic ranting. Following in a long tradition of reactionary thought dating back to the opponents of the French Revolution, early 19th century, Camus sees democracy as a degradation of high culture, and he embraces an elitist vision of society where only the elect are the shepherds of culture. There are overlaps with the Marxist left's vociferations against the petit bourgeoisie, such as in the work of the filmmaker and poet Pasolini, but Camus' rejection of liberal democracy is closer to Heidegger's than to the revolutionary left. It is a celebration of roots and dwelling and the integrity and authenticity of the homeland, Heimat. In this essentialism, clothed as humanism, a new style of racism was born, based on the rejection of multiculturalism in the name of preserving the diversity of cultures. Now let me examine the Great Replacement theory in its own right, as if it were a serious theory, and let me play the devil's advocate for a moment. What if, Horresco reference, Camus and his followers were right? What if the immigration policy and opening of borders could only result in clashes and violence? What if it betrayed a purely instrumental conception of the human, a system that dehumanizes people by uprooting them as if they were spare parts or cogs in a machine? What if immigration was a ploy of global capitalism to obtain cheap labor and liquidate culture in order to turn nations into playgrounds and Disneyland resorts for decerebrated consumers? People who would be uniform, people who would be one-dimensional. This critique of a human experience turned artificial may seem legitimate and even alluring. The problem is that Camus wants it both ways. If on the one hand he denounces the instrumentalization of human beings through capitalism, mass migration, exploitation, on the other hand, the very concept of replacement subscribes to an artificial conception of life in general and of human life in particular. It is impossible to talk about human population replacing another human population without subscribing to an instrumental conception of human life, without considering human life as an IKEA piece of furniture. Despite the allure of Camus' theory of the replaceable man, despite his denunciation of the reign of quantity, the claim that human beings can be replaced because the place of dwelling is something static and defined once and for all, this claim is inherently artificial. The Great Replacement is an ideology based on a static, artificial conception of the human. It is in contradiction with the legitimate denunciation of a cynical conception of the human as disposable material. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Bruno. Our next speaker is Riv-Ellen Prell.
Thank you to my colleagues for organizing this. Unfortunately, I have a cold thanks to my 3-year-old granddaughter. And if you have trouble hearing me, let me know. I'm kind of hoarse. I thought of these remarks to be titled, "What Racists and Anti-Semites, quote, shouted in the 1930s in Minnesota and the upper Midwest that rhymed with Jews will not replace us." Anti-Semitism is an umbrella term that only makes sense in the context of an historic period, nation, region, and culture. The question is, who holds anti-Semitic ideas and how do they construct, quote, the Jew? Is it an ideology of a political movement or a basis for exclusion from clubs and higher education? Religion, race, and nation are historical categories loosely applied in this nation and others. For example, to an American nativist who opposed immigration in the first third of the 20th century, Protestants were American and non-Protestants were incapable of loyalty. Jews and people of color were, quote, unredeemable because they had an essence that could not change. Race was constantly reshaped to serve the political ends of those in power and those aggrieved by powerlessness. Americans drew on images, stereotypes, theories of the, quote, Jew to prove that they threatened the nation and the economy. In my brief time, I want to contrast the alt-right of today and the 1930s Silver Legion to understand changes and continuities in political anti-Semitism. By the mid-1930s, reflecting global and national economic and political forces, anti-Semitism was fully integrated in American life. What puzzles many Americans is that American anti-Semitism was and is far less about a religion, Judaism, that is a heresy to Christianity, than a dangerous fantasy that America's foundation was and is white and Christian, and Jews and people of color cannot therefore be American. This anti-Semitism renders Jews as people who undermine the safety, economy, and morality of the United States. Social and political anti-Semitism was in part related to the pernicious late 19th and 20th century era of race science that served to control and then essentially closed immigration to Southern and Eastern Europeans, largely Jewish and Catholic, and excluded all people from Africa and Asia beyond those previously excluded from China. Race science misused evolution to declare a racial hierarchy in America. Anglo-Saxons, a term exclusively used in the United States and not Europe, were touted as racially superior and declared all others as not only inferior, but alien to the United States and in need of controlling through limiting their right to births, outlawing unions, and immigration exclusion. Institutions that welcomed Jews in the late 19th century shunned them a decade later. They were excluded because they were Jews from buying or renting homes, colleges, professions, employment, organizations, among many others. All Jews, no matter their differences from one another, became a single category to be shunned in the nation. Political anti-Semitism, an ideology that blames Jews for all political problems globally and nationally, which include economic failure, poverty, credit, labor unrest, urban problems, creators of the Russian Revolution, and all immorality, appeared around World War I and throughout the interwar period. As urban people, Jews were viewed as unwholesome and the natural enemy of those in rural areas and small towns. These views became central to the political programs of both populists in the South, the Midwest, and the Far West, as well as conservative Republicans and Democrats. The roots of nativism and white Christian nationalism stretch far back in American history to the nation's origins. But more immediately, for the 1930s, it stretches to World War I and its aftermath, when the government created an apparatus that persecuted dissenters, and many Americans championed campaigns of 100% America and America First, all of which fed and abated white supremacy and nativism. By the 1930s in the nation, but especially in the Twin Cities and throughout the upper Midwest, white Christian nationalism and nativism captured the loyalty of many Americans in a region that was heavily of German descent and more homogeneous than other areas. Their ideas, as it were, rhymed with Nazism and fascism, admiration for Hitler, fear of the US entering another war in Europe, and the trauma of the economic depression pointed them toward blaming Jews for all these problems. In a variety of organizations, some small and ephemeral, and some with an enormous following that were stopped only because of federal government intervention, Jews were identified as the source of the world's problems in general, and the nation's problems in particular. Crossing social class, followers included workers, farmers, and industrialists. Some thought of Jews as a red menace, some as greedy bankers, some as destroyers of Christian morality. These groups' demagogic leaders blamed Jews for the nation's economic failures, for undue influence over political leaders, especially Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who they insisted was a Jew despite his patrician Christian lineage, for capitalism, for the Russian Revolution, and for the failures of the New Deal. They insisted that the nation was under the control of a handful of Jewish men around Roosevelt, and in the state of Minnesota, around Governors Floyd Olson and Elmer Benson. One publication that provided the ideological underpinnings for these groups is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a 1902 fabricated tract that originated in Russia that purports to provide the minutes of a meeting for a Jewish plan for world domination through economic takeover and popular culture whose purpose was to destroy Christianity. It became one of the most important weapons of anti-Semitism in the 20th century and influenced an entire spectrum of conspiracy theorists and groups, from Henry Ford in the stratosphere of American life, who distributed 500,000 copies through his car dealerships, to the followers of Minnesota's white Christian supremacists. Tens of thousands of Americans and Minnesotans found theories of Jewish conspiracies, power, and manipulation entirely convincing. In Minnesota, Republican leaders of big business, some churches and right-wing organizations created remarkably disturbing alliances. Among the most prominent fascist pro-Nazi groups were the German-American Bund, the Silver Shirts, also known as the Silver Legion, and the Christian Nation, which was one of the organizations that evolved out of the radio empire created by Father Coughlin of Detroit. 3 smaller organizations were headquartered in Minnesota in the mid-1930s, some only briefly. Each combined an anti-union perspective with Christianity and anti-Semitism, as well as opposition to war and alliances with Britain. These groups viewed as enemies the former Labor Party, the highly successful Minnesota Progressive Third Party that held all statewide offices, Senate seats, and dominated the state house during the 30s. The Silver Legion, also known as the Silver Shirts, which is briefly my focus, combined all the key elements of white Christian supremacy and isolationism nationalism. The organization was founded by William Dudley Pelley. It grew and contracted throughout the 1930s, partly in response to his legal problems, with a solid base of supporters in 1936 in Minneapolis and again in 1938. The organization welcomed any person over 18 who was not Jewish or African American. Like the Klan, he appealed to racial purity for the nation. Members were required to read, in addition to all of Pelley's writings, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which continues to resonate into the 21st century with white supremacists and anti-Semites all over the world. Pelley, who was a Hollywood writer, a failed novelist, and an eccentric who claimed his prophecies came from God and Jesus and insisted that he foresaw the Depression and Hitler's rise to power. He built coalitions with other local groups that included the Ku Klux Klan and the German-American Bund to advance a Christian white nationalist agenda. The Nazi Party even dubbed him one of the nation's first native fascists and used his writings in their propaganda about the US. Pelley and his second-in-command, Roy Zachary, claimed that Jews had control of credit and finance, industry, distribution, education, and politics. All businessmen in the East were Jews. They had a monopoly on all moving pictures and radio. Jews were responsible for the Great Depression and the Russian Revolution. Zachary promised that, quote, in the near future, Americans would have to rise and stop them. His battle cry was for Christianity and the Constitution, though he was kidding about the Constitution, and down with the Reds and out with the Jews, which they were not kidding about. Pelley envisioned a new America that would isolate all Jews into a single city per state so they could not interfere with his utopia. He claimed that there were 22 million Jews in America when there were a tiny fraction of that number, and that they were under the control of 1 million rabbis. Free of Jews, he would create a new economy in which all wealth would be held by the government and followers would receive a guaranteed income. No accumulation would be allowed. The Silver Legion was inexpensive to join. Their numbers were, of course, difficult to estimate. Pelley claimed 25,000 followers and vast numbers of sympathizers. Other estimates put the number at 15,000 with a similarly large group of sympathizers, which was not insignificant. Nationally, members of the Silver Legion tended to be of British and German background. They were either working or middle class, but about 15% of them were professionals, and they were especially appealing to physicians who believed that their social status was under attack, and also to industrialists. 1% of the state's population in Minnesota and western states was typically the number of groups like the Silver Legion. Minnesota was fertile ground for the organization. In 1936, the University of Minnesota had a student group, the Swastikas, that was affiliated with the Silver Legion, that probably began in 1934. Between 1936 and 1938, Minneapolis boosted a growing cadre of followers of Pelley and Zachary, who affiliated with the Silver Shirts. They attracted wealthy business people, some of whom attended their meetings and were outed. Together, the Silver Shirts and the organizers of major industrial leaders infiltrated Teamsters Union Local 544 that had successfully organized a major strike in 1934 in order to spy on them for business leaders. Silver Shirts were embedded in Minneapolis churches and had the support of a number of pastors, principally William Bell Riley, whose Minneapolis church had 7,000 followers. Riley was a major anti-evolutionist in the 20s. He embraced the conspiracy theories of Jews' domination of the world and blamed World War I on Jewish profiteers, and claimed that the Soviet Union was under the control of Jewish atheists, and that Jews supported evolution in order to destroy Christianity. The Silver Shirts, both locally and nationally, took a great interest in the Minnesota governor's race in 1938. Their members distributed leaflets in support of the Republican Harold Stassen, and in their newspaper advised the followers, if you don't want Jewish communism with resulting violence, bloodshed, and civil war, and of course nobody does, get out at once and help defeat Elmer Benson and his criminal cohorts with ballots. If it can't be done with ballots now, then there must be bullets later. Historian William Milliken notes that in August of 1938, just 3 months before the election, Pelley dispatched Zachary to Minnesota from North Carolina to enlist 3,000 to 5,000 new members. While the Silver Shirts were attacked by many churches and civic leaders, the group remained popular and participants simply sought secrecy. What seems to particularly unify those attracted to these groups was a conviction shared with nativists and anti-labor and isolationists that America was fundamentally a white Christian Anglo-Saxon, again an invented category, enterprise. Borders must be contained, homogeneity enforced. Historian John Hyam argues that anti-immigrant nativist ideas were, quote, less a summon to fight than a command to withdraw. They were committed to belligerent isolation. Whatever instabilities were created by the Depression, changing economies, work, and uncertainty, the driving force of the Silver Shirts, I would certainly argue, was white supremacy and the hope that economic changes would follow. There are, of course, great differences between contemporary white Christian nationalists and those in the interwar years. Above all, the internet has easily created a global movement advocating violence that is difficult to compare to Pelley dispatching Zachary to Minnesota with veiled threats to Jews. The FBI just yesterday released its statistics for the year, which reveal that while hate crimes are down somewhat, violence has substantially increased. The Klan of the 20s was certainly a violent organization, but less so than the others that I have discussed, despite ideologies of violence. Yet this very week we have a remarkable example of an alt-right ideas and activism that do eerily rhyme with the 30s. Donald Trump Jr. appeared at UCLA on November 10th in order to talk about his new book, Triggered: How the Left Thrives on Hate and Wants to Silence Us. Expecting and probably hoping for a great hue and cry from the left, who barely showed up, he was shouted off the stage in 20 minutes by the alt-right and its neo-Nazi allies among them. For their leader, Nick Fuentes, a 22-year-old, Trump Jr. represents a failure to uphold President Trump's vision, which he claims has been co-opted by a cabal of deep staters. They insist on closing the borders to any immigrant who is not white and ending all diplomatic relationships globally. Christianity, they claim, is under attack, and degeneracy has been encouraged by allowing gay speakers. Jews remain dangerous conspirators, and Israel is an enemy because Israelis brought down the towers on 9/11, and they can prove through videos that 5 Israelis danced after. White genocide appears to them a grave danger. America first can only be realized if the nation is 100% white and Christian, and calls for the reinstitution of Jim Crow laws. They state that demographic replacement is real, and it will be catastrophic. For the alt-right, Jew is the alien, the global insinuator who has invented the Holocaust and for whom Israel is America's enemy. They build a political party around this vision. Despite the economic differences between depression and a global economy, between the ages of the white supremacists of the 30s and today, between the digital and analog worlds, what we see at work are remarkably similar themes: a belligerent isolationism, a border closed to immigrants, a Christian imagined whiteness, and a fear of replacement by Jews. All hangs on a slender but tenacious thread of aggrieved white men enraged by an America built on diversity, international relationships, and a vision for the future.
Our next presenter is Malinda Lindquist from the Department of History.
Great, thank you so much. Can you hear me? So my goal today is to trouble and historicize great replacement theories and to demonstrate that these theories are not new. Rather, they're central to a longer history and to a project that American historian Lothrop started in 1920 called white world supremacy. Today I want to focus on 3 moments spanning from the 1820s to the 1920s. All were moments when white racial nationalism converged with theories of racial extinction and replacement. In the first case, the mid-19th century witnessed a series of white efforts to solidify the myth of native extinction. Over and over, indigenous peoples were forced through a deeply disturbing type of genocide theater to recount their own racial passing. In the second case, after the Civil War and coming into the era of Reconstruction, white nationalists would try to reimagine a nation that had been built on slavery as one where African Americans were alien and would soon naturally perish. That is to say, racial extinction and theories of replacement are central, even foundational, to understandings of whiteness. The Great Replacement Theory is, in my estimation, just the latest permutation of a 2-century-long white world supremacy project. Moreover, putting the Great Replacement Theory into a broader historical framework is important for a number of reasons. First, because it provides some perspective about the nature of mass violence in the age of Trump. There is clearly something deeply troubling about these recent episodes, but to focus too narrowly on these spectacles and to center, even if unintentionally, a radical manifesto-writing, conspiratorial white supremacist fringe is dangerous to the extent that it makes these acts appear exceptional. That is, it makes white world supremacy appear to be a project of a crazed white fringe, as opposed to a part of a broader set of policies and histories that have and continue to value the lives of whites over the lives of non-whites. This valuing, which is a key feature of Great Replacement Theory, is in fact a central tenet of contemporary white supremacy. And episodes of mass violence are clearly specific moments where that racial calculation appears most in evidence. But mass violence is an irregular event. And to highlight the irregular at the expense of the very normal, everyday ways in which white lives are continuously protected and valued above non-white lives is to essentially do the work of white supremacy. Part of that work is to hide the quotidian nature of the violence that is inherent in its project. This gets me to my second point about replacement theories and the trouble with framing them as conspiracy theories. The first trouble is that it obfuscates the very real histories of earlier race replacement projects. Is that centering the conspiracy serves to hide the wider white supremacist project. And finally, I want to suggest that conspiracies aside, Great Replacement Theory and its antecedents reveal some fundamental truths about the nature of whiteness and its evolution and mutation over the past century. So I want to focus my comments today on what I see as some of these important antecedents to the Great Replacement Theory. Like today, there have been other moments when whites have worried deeply about the feasibility and sustainability of white world supremacy. At those moments, the historical responses have generally moved in two directions. Both responses are based in fears, both real and imagined, and have the possibility of encouraging and even naturalizing white violence as reasonable, if not an appropriate response. One type of response tends to interpret any challenge to whiteness through the prism of race war. The other type of response tends to interpret the problems of whiteness through the prism of race suicide. In the first case, generating fears about the near inevitability of a race war positions whites as vulnerable, victimized, and the aggrieved party. In the second case, race suicide functions as an internal critique where the failure to effectively and sustainably reproduce whiteness is the culprit. In both cases, however, the populations assaulted by the real-world effects of these theories are non-whites. I will also add that there is a third response that effectively melds these two prominent responses, and here I'm thinking of those moments specifically in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when the United States and other white settler colonialist nations largely closed their borders to non-whites, both in anticipation of the race war that immigrant invaders might foment, and as an effort to internally reset and stabilize whiteness in response to fears of race suicide. That is, there's nothing new about the white supremacist xenophobic elements of the Great Replacement theory. It is a story that is at least a century old in the United States. Great Replacement-like theories are the twin foundations of white nationalism. In the first case, because they're central to explaining and naturalizing white supremacy, and in the second case, because they are used to justify and defend white supremacy from threats both real and imagined. Rather, what is new, and we should not forget how new, is the radical anti-racist project that has fundamentally challenged the white supremacist foundations of the nation. A clear fracture in that narrative of white racial nationalism in the United States, for example, took place in 1952, when for the first time in the nation's history, with the McCarran-Walter Act, non-white immigrants were able to become naturalized citizens, a right that did not exist for the first 175 years of the nation's history. Now, as I mentioned at the start, white supremacy loves extinction and replacement stories, but with one caveat, and that is white supremacy loves extinction and replacement stories as long as non-whites are the ones going extinct and being replaced. And I just want to say a few more words about the two moments that I mentioned earlier, because white settler colonialism, if nothing else, is a real-life account of a great replacement. And on the heels of that success, there were forecasts that the demise of blacks was just over the horizon. There's nothing new or surprising about this story. Rather, what I want to foreground in any conversation that purports to take fears about white replacement seriously, even if only through the lens of conspiracy, is that historically whites have been the replacers, and they have continuously and simultaneously narrated the story of replacement. White world supremacy loves storytelling. In her book, Firsting and Lasting, Writing Indians Out of Existence in New England, our very own, my very own colleague, Jeannie O'Brien, charts this complicated process of erasure, whereby O'Brien writes, the collective story New Englanders told insisted that non-Indians held exclusive sway over modernity, denied modernity to Indians, and in the process created a narrative of Indian extinction that has stubbornly remained in the consciousness and unconsciousness of Americans. Analyzing, quote, the ways in which local texts narrated Indian history and extinction, O'Brien is clear that these narratives were central to the project of building a white nation that could deny its Indian past, its Indian present, and its Indian future, even and probably especially in the face of Indian persistence. Having rhetorically disposed of the Indians, white social scientists spent the last decades of the 19th century predicting the extinction of blacks in the United States. In 1884, Nathaniel Schaefer, a Harvard scientist, asserted that blacks were, quote, a people without a single trace of promise except that of extinction through the disease of sloth and vice. According to historian Khalil Gibran Muhammad, social scientists would, quote, interpret the 1890 census data as a ray of hope that blacks were steadily moving towards extinction in the United States. Muhammad continues, they explain this movement towards extinction as the natural fate of a primitive race, struggling to survive on its own in an advanced civilized society. Moreover, in both cases, these stories of indigenous and black replacement went hand in hand with policies that continue to dispossess, disenfranchise, and assault the bodies and the communities of both groups. These were the decades of removal and allotment on the one hand, and of lynching and disenfranchisement on the other. And I point to these stories to remind us that there are real stories of great replacements. The 19th century witnessed the consolidation of white world supremacy through practices of storytelling that were not merely imaginative. Rather, these theories went hand in hand with white nationalist state-building projects that wrote Indians and blacks out of the national narrative. The last moment that I want to touch on is the one that bears the strongest resemblance to the moment that we're living through. This third set of stories can be traced back to the immigration dates of the late 19th and early 20th century, and the efforts of white settler colonialist nations to protect white world supremacy by closing borders to non-whites and not quite whites. These decades witnessed surges in immigration from China and Japan, and also from immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Immigration restrictions swept white settler colonialist nations that feared their whiteness would be swamped by, and I have to thank Lothrop Stoddard again, their fear was that they were going to be swamped by, quote, a rising tide of color. These white extinction stories, I would argue, function in ways that are very similar to contemporary great replacement theories. That is, they pretend to be the bane of white world supremacy, though they more often signify critical moments of white racial retrenchment. In the United States, these stories were penned by theorists and eugenicists like Madison Grant, who authored The Passing of the Great Race in 1918, and by Lothrop Stoddard, who authored The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy in 1920. Both linked political ideologies to race and argued that the radical thinking that immigrants arrived with was essentially a racial or hereditary trait that would swamp and replace the Anglo-Saxon foundations of the nation. Stoddard wrote, the whole white race is exposed immediately and ultimately to the possibility of social sterilization and final replacement or absorption by the teeming colored races. Grant and Stoddard worked for the passage of the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act that completely racialized the U.S. immigration system. Internally, at this same moment, concerns about race suicide authorized decades of eugenic policies that led to the sterilization of the most vulnerable people. That is, the fear of white replacement generated policies that had a direct and devastating impact on the bodies of certain Americans and on border fortifications that no doubt harmed immigrants fleeing economic, political, and social repression. Which brings us to our current moment. And I want to close where I began, with a warning to not replace a broad inquiry into the retrenchment of white world supremacy, which has been underway for quite some time, with too narrow a focus on mass violence in the age of Trump. White nationalists have spent decades priming a global audience for the arrival of a president that could so easily reduce Mexican immigrants to a bunch of rapists and murderers with a few good people thrown in. White world supremacy depends on these types of formulations, but even more so, it depends on all those other policies that emanate from this type of thinking. Policies that allow for an immigration system that assumes, for example, that Latinx populations are fundamentally illegal. What this translates into is a nation state that spends half of its time policing and deporting immigrant populations, and the other half of its time making immigrant populations so fearful of the state and its proxies that many are forced to live in the shadows, vulnerable and largely insecure. White people, white supremacists, like extinction stories. World white supremacy hinges on extinction stories. The best stories erase everyone that isn't white, but even the scary stories, the stories where whites are reimagined as the victim, do important white supremacist work, since the rhetorical victimization of whites ensures the continuous and largely uninterrupted real-life violence against non-whites. There's no doubt that the recent episodes of violence are one response to great replacement fears, but the real conspiracy would be to pretend that there is something particularly Trumpian about this moment, and to miss that this moment is not unlike previous moments of white nationalist retrenchment.
Thank you so much, Malinda, for this insightful presentation. And our final speaker of the panel is Joe Gerteis of the Sociology department.
Thank you very much. I'm going to show you some pictures. I hope this doesn't, oh, it is going to blind you. I'm so sorry. I thought that would only one size. Bruno, I apologize. Today I want to talk not so much about conspiracy theories and violence per se, but rather I want to help set some context for understanding events like Charlottesville, like the attacks on mosques and synagogues that we've witnessed and that some of our panelists have spoken about. In particular, I want to first present some data from work that I've done on Americans' attitudes about Jews and Muslims. That's two particular targets of the far-right great replacement theories throughout the ages. And I then want to develop some lessons that from my own work and from some older scholarship as well, lessons that I hope will be useful for both activists but also for scholars trying to think about such violence as well as confront some of it. So the first question, why Jews and why Muslims? Hostility towards Muslims, and indeed the politicization not just of radical Islam, but of Islam itself and as all Muslims in the United States, has become clearly apparent. The sociologist Chris Bale has shown that this hostility towards Muslims moved into mainstream media discourses in recent decades as it was pushed by far-right think tanks and NGOs. But what became apparent in 2016 was the degree to which it moved from the fringe to the mainstream of the Republican Party as well, with Donald Trump as well as other presidential contenders trying to top each other's very heated rhetorics. I'm sure many in this room remember Trump's talk of the Riverside neighborhood as being a no-go zone. It was just before he had a rally here, a kind of a hellscape that nobody could enter into. You might not remember that during the campaign, Trump proposed a database to track all Muslims in the United States, while Ted Cruz suggested police surveillance to patrol and secure Muslim neighborhoods. That was his way of putting it. So Islamophobia is at the heart of the far right now. It's become central to the American version of the Great Replacement argument. Of course, the longer history of such claims in Europe had Jews as central. That seemed maybe less central in the United States in recent decades, and then came Charlottesville. And "You will not replace us" became "Jews will not replace us," and all the talk of the Soros-led conspiracies since suggests that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are in lockstep. So, a starting question, are they? So let me present some data. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to show a few numbers. This is from a national survey conducted in the immediate pre-Trump era, 2014, where my colleagues and I have tried to make sense of some of these questions. For the survey itself, I need to credit Doug Hartman and Penny Edgell in the Department of Sociology, who are the co-PIs on the project with me. The figures I'm showing here are from a paper I'm doing with a graduate student named Mir Rotem. Making sense of opinions is important, I think, before we even talk about any of the numbers, because there are only so many radicalized people out there. There are only so many people who are marching, for example, in Charlottesville, and chanting and shooting and bombing. But the question is, how many potentially radicalized people are there? The first figure here compares the levels of acceptance of Jews and Muslims among white Americans. This is the first main finding I want to get across. It's that there is a lot of expressed Islamophobia out there that people are very happy to tell you about, even in surveys. But I also want to point out that there's not a small amount of anti-Semitism, even if the levels of Islamophobia kind of run past them. There are, by the way, two sorts of survey items shown here. The top two are general acceptance measures. The first one is, the question went, I would disapprove if my son or daughter wanted to marry a person of this type, and one question was about Jews, one question was about Muslims. The other one was, this group does not at all share my vision of American society. And then below that are some opinion items that get to the sorts of beliefs that are behind the Great Replacement claims, that the group in question is less loyal to America than to, say, Islam or to Israel, that there are culturally different and unassimilable groups, or that they have too much power. Again, on all of these measures, there's much more Islamophobia, but not a negligible amount of rejection of Jews. And this is 2014 data, national data. For example, more than 40% of white Americans say that Muslims do not at all share my vision of America. But over 15% also say that Jews don't share my vision of America. The gap is somewhat bigger when we look at what kinds of problems are associated with these groups. The reaction to Muslims is particularly striking on some issues, like lack of public order and safety, or lack of shared values and morals, or increasing intolerance and incivility, or special interests are taking over our political institutions. By the way, this is one place where a comparative point needs to be made. It's somewhat different in the United States than it is in Europe. The economic measures about jobs and welfare, those are measures on which, if you add another group in there, immigrants, that one jumps up for immigrants, but it's not particularly attached to Jews or to Muslims in the United States, although it very much is in Europe right now, at least. Okay, last, this is a technical thing, but I'll make it non-technical. Anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim attitudes track together to some degree, but not fully. What I have up here, it's a latent class analysis of the same data I was just showing you in the last table. Latent class analysis, it's a technique that can be used to assess patterns in this kind of response data. The point here is that there are empirically 4 groupings or quote-unquote classes of response among white Americans. The good news, just over half of white Americans are neither very anti-Muslim or anti-Jew. But then the bad news, that leaves about half of America, or white Americans. About 23% have consistently anti-Muslim views. That's group 2 up there, though not necessarily anti-Jewish views. About 22% have a mix of both, And then there are the kinds of folks that are marching. They're only about 3% of the population, but they are very strongly and consistently anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish. So the two views go together, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and more precisely, they're nested. Anti-Semitism seems to mark a smaller but more radical position. Those who are anti-Semites are also anti-Muslim, not necessarily the reverse, at least as it's expressed. Now, the question to me is how many people among the class 2 and class 3 here can be pulled in? And this requires me to get off of the data and on to some broader points and lessons. So I'd like to zoom out and spend just a few minutes making a few points that I think are important to interpreting the current political moment and the data that I've just shown. First, there's a debate long-standing in academic circles and not newly revived about what's driving this. Is it racism? Is it religious sorts of prejudice? There's a really fascinating discussion in sociology right now about exactly this as it pertains to Islamophobia in the United States, with a lot of sociologists reframing it in terms of racial forms of othering. But I think the overall answer has to be yes, it's both. It's both and empirically there's no clear distinction between those two things. The second point that I want to make is that we shouldn't forget that both overlap with civic boundaries. This is the point that, that so far all of the panelists have made to varying degrees. Who is seen as capable of being a good citizen and who's seen as belonging in the more public sense? Because racism and religious prejudice point to individually held kinds of opinions. I don't like specifically those kinds of people. But it becomes a different thing when it's also those kinds of people aren't able to be good citizens, because that's how racism and religious prejudice becomes racial and religious forms of nationalism. So I think there's a lesson here for academics. We cannot get compartmentalized when we're talking about these sorts of things. I think this is probably somewhat disciplinary specific, but overall there are people that specialize in certain fields, certain time fields, or certain fields of study, for example, the study of race or the study of religion, or the study of civic life and civic boundaries. And I think it's very important not to separate those out if we're trying to make sense of a moment like the one we're in. Secondly, and again to echo some of the things that have already been said, remember that something like a great replacement theory and a great replacement claim, it goes way back. There's an essay I just recently reread. Many of you have heard of it and probably read it. Richard Hofstadter's The Paranoid Style in American Politics. By the way, this is, you can get this quite easily. I think it was published, I can't remember, Harper's or The Atlantic, one of the two, and Harper's, thank you. And they've got a free version of it that you can go and grab anytime. It's a really fascinating one to read right now. This is from 1964. He is responding to, I thought that was me for a second. He is responding to John Bircher's and others in his time, but he does it by looking back. And so he's looking back at a paranoid style in American politics that he sees reaching back at least to the early 19th century, with anti-Masonic and other kinds of conspiracy theories that he thinks works very much in the same way. But you can go back further than that. Of course, Hannah Arendt traced much of the same kinds of claims back in Europe even earlier. From my own point of view, there's another lesson here too. Be careful about conflating breadth and depth, because there's a huge amount of anti-Muslim sentiment now. It hasn't always been so, and I think it's a little soft. Most of those people won't be in the same place, I hope, in 10 or 15, 20 years. And I'm saying that because they weren't in the same place 10 or 15 or 20 years before. But that doesn't mean it's not a problem. The question is, who among those groups of people who express an attitude but aren't going out and marching are capturable by the sorts of people who are, because there's a vanguard of ideologues that move between movements and move between time periods when such marches are much more public, because they aren't always. One other point that I'd like to make, in the 1970s, Seymour Martin Lipset called this kind of right-wing extremism a politics of unreason. This kind of thinking shares a logic, no matter which group it's targeted at a given moment. And it says more about the presumed we and fears about decline of that group than it does about the groups that are being targeted, ultimately, I think. There's a lesson here too, and that is, I think that we need to speak to what extremist fears mean and not just what they say. For example, one can, and many have, argued for the fact that immigrants are less likely to commit crimes in America, and that immigrant neighborhoods are less crime-ridden than other kinds of neighborhoods in the United States. But that doesn't change the minds of anybody that truly believes it, because it's not really about the belief and what it says on the surface, it's about what it's sort of pointing to underneath. There are also some structural differences over time, and this will be my last point. In particular, in 70, I guess, Seymour Martin Lipset concluded this book, The Politics of Unreason, by noting that the American people have always been vulnerable to extremism. But what has saved us is that American political institutions have provided stability. Clearly, that's not always true, and not always at every moment true, and it certainly isn't true right now. And I think that's what's particularly fragile and particularly difficult and frightening about the current moment. And so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you all for these very thought-provoking presentations. We have about 25 minutes. We will open it up